Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to another ranking video for Final Fantasy XIV. This time, I'm going to be taking a look at the trials for Heavensward. For the A Realm Reborn one, there were a lot more trials to judge. In fact, I had to leave a bunch of them out because I really didn't know how to judge some of their difficulties against one another. However, with Heavensward, things were much more direct. We had 7 trials, we had 2 upon the initial release, at least extreme difficulty trials, and then 1 was added in each subsequent patch, which they've largely kept to since then, minus a few things that we'll get to talk about in the other expansions. With that, this is one of my favorite expansions to talk about the trials, so I'm really looking forward to ranking all 7 of these encounters for you. That being said, starting the list off with number 7, and I think it's a pretty obvious one in that of Bismarck. I really don't think anyone would be surprised by this if you were around during Heavensward. Bismarck is legit just killing a few sets of ads and then shooting some dragon killers at him in order to pull him close, jump on his back, and then DPS his head, his corona as it's called. I mean, there is an actual ad phase where you're supposed to have the tank swap, and there's these debuffs that can mean you either reflect damage back at yourself or, you actually just deal damage to the ad. And there's tornadoes all over the place during that particular phase. It's not a bad ad phase, but it doesn't really redeem the rest of the fight being just killing a bunch of Vanu and then getting on his back. I do like some aspects about this. The storms mechanic in the later phase, I think, is mildly interesting. Just being able to look at the environment and just have to go, okay, there's a thunderstorm. The weather also changes on the minimap. These are the mechanics that will happen. But it's still just, it doesn't really do enough for the encounter. So all I'll do is enjoy that when you jump on his back, you take damage. The storms mechanic actually looks aesthetically cool. And I love the 12-second loop that are both of the Bismarck songs, phase 1 and phase 2. But it had to go at number 7, right at the bottom of this list. Now, that being said, everyone after this was kind of tough. I really had to kind of reach into, I wouldn't call them petty reasons to figure out where I was going to place everything else, at least in the middle of the list. But it certainly was nothing that, if ranked against some of the other expansions, would have really netted them a lower spot. So for number 6, I decided to go with Zerven. Now, I'm sure some of you think this is because of the classic meme of skipping Soar, but it's just that the fight's a bit too basic. That's what it is. Phase 1, phase 2, and the ad phase, there's a couple of things that are interesting in there, but it just feels like I wish I could just go to the last phase. Some fights, I feel like the first phases really kind of build up the encounter, and that doesn't feel like it's the case here. Not to mention the, in my opinion, really awkward ultimate attack that Zerven has where he charges through a snowflake. I don't know, it's just kind of weird. The final phase is actually pretty good. He's got the knockback into the laser, and then there's, of course, the spread and the stack mechanics, and having to actually do Soar. It was always funny to me. Everyone's like, yeah, we have to skip Soar in the first phase. And then people don't learn how to do it, and they just die to it in the second phase anyway. I was like, what was the point of doing that? But overall, while I don't think it's a bad encounter, it certainly has a lower quality, I feel, than the rest of the encounters on this list. And that makes number 5 kind of a weird one for me, because I feel dirty doing this. My number 5 is Ravana. Man, it's so thematically and executionally different than almost every EX Primal, and not in the way that Bismarck was. Bismarck was like a failed attempt at being that. Ravana, who released alongside Bismarck, was not a failed attempt in any way. I mean, the alternating stances, each having their own different attacks, you having the one phase where he takes a ton more damage, the phase where he takes less damage, dealing damage, actually pushing his phases faster to push his gauge up faster, so you can see more or less of a specific mechanic. And the actual attacks and the variety here is really, really well done. Despite all of that, it never really feels like it's too much because it's paced extremely well. Honestly, I'm kind of disappointed this hasn't been an Unreal yet, and I'm afraid they're not even going to make it on an Unreal. I feel like they're going to go through the Heavensward trials and not double back to Ravana. Honestly, the only reason it's landing at number 5 is because of those long cast phases where he takes bonus damage. It just kind of slows the fight down a little bit too much and is incredibly abusable. Even back when it was brand new, we skipped so much of the later part of the fight just because of saving damage for that damage increased phase. And so that really knocks down a lot of the fun stuff, especially the limit cut-esque mechanic that Ravana, people credit limit cut with what's his face, with Cruise Chaser. And yes, that is like technically the full limit cut with all 8 markers, but Ravana had limit cut light way before that, and nobody gives him credit for it because most of us skipped it. So while it wasn't an easy decision, I feel like it's right to put him at number 5. Now, number 4 is going to be Sophia. This was actually heavily influenced by the fact that this is the Unreal encounter right now. And just having done it a bunch more recently and then looking back at old footage before it came out, it just felt like this needed to be smack dab in the middle of the list to make it the most balanced decision that I could make. And it's not even just a pun. Everything about this fight kind of screams Goldilocks to me. It's all just right. It is a decent mix of dangerous mechanics, but in a mostly recoverable encounter. I mean, even back in the day, it was the first encounter where if you fell off, you could then be resurrected anyway. And it felt like a good change. It felt like something that made sense for this fight, or made sense for the direction that the game was going when this fight came out. Its ad phase is equally as cheesable as it is dangerous. I see people screw it up all the time, get confused, die when they're not supposed to, and then fail to die when they're supposed to. That's a whole nother thing. And the last phase feels like a decent evolution of the first phase, but also never really takes off too far, you know, and never really reaches too far beyond what you expect of it once you learn the arena can tilt. But it does have a decent variety. There's a lot of tank busters, a lot of tank swaps, a lot of knockbacks, a lot of raid-wide damage, and the clone mechanic is also something that's pretty good, something we've seen since then, but was done really well upon its initial execution here. But the big thing is that this is a list based on how I feel about these encounters. And for me, Sophia never really impressed as an encounter, but it was also never bad in any particular way. So for me, again, it feels like it's just the right balance of things to land it smack dab in the middle of this list. Now, from this point on, we're going into my top 3, and I'm not going to lie, they are leagues above the first 4. 4, 5, and 6 were kind of hard, but 3, 2, and 1 are really, really easy to me. And I'm going to start number 3 with Nidhog, the final steps of faith. This is a big improvement for me from number 4. And I think the biggest thing is how much more atmospheric and aesthetically pleasing this and the next 2 encounters are. On top of having an exceptional array of mechanics while still feeling like an EX trial difficulty. Nidhogg's first phase serves just decent enough to get a few basics out of the way, but I think if it weren't for the context of the rest of the fight, it would be a weaker first phase. It's very short, not a whole lot happens. If you can, you do see the dive bombs, you do see the puddles placed on the ground. There's some things to it that you definitely want to know for the later phases, but it's by no means impressive on its own. But it builds up, it's like the start of a song that's just kind of getting you into it. And I think that's the beauty of it. It is the end of the Dragon Song War, and every phase feels like a piece of a composition. They all have their own music. They all, build up to this one final phase. And that just goes such a long way at making these even simpler things more enjoyable. I also really like the ad phase, very much on the tanks to be good with their mitigation, very much on the DPS to kill the ads quickly enough to make sure the tanks don't have to do any sort of shenanigans. And everyone still has to be dodging that third ad that just shoots fireballs and tries to swing at people. Not to mention the hilariousness in people's kind of misinterpretation of going from the ad phase to the Nidstinian phase. There's 8 circles on the ground, so everyone thought, oh, everyone needs to stand in a circle in order to survive this attack, because people were just dying outright to the damage from Final Chorus, and it was just, they just blamed it on not doing the mechanic correctly by standing in the circles, but it was just nobody was mitigating. We weren't really as good at that kind of stuff back then as a whole community for the game, but it was especially noticeable here. So I have that hilarious memory to add into there. Not to mention the Nidstinian phase, man, that's one of my favorite EX phases just across all of them. It has so many little things that you need to do, but again, it's really just putting the pressure on you to get out of the way of a lot of stuff until the Fang and Claw mechanic, which is one of my favorite EX mechanics. I mean, it requires very careful movement. You just need to understand what it means when you have a specific tether and what the conditions for killing each of the Fang and Claw are. And I just like that little bit of involvement that's there. But again, it all hits a crescendo when you get to Enraged Nidhogg. Now, Enraged Nidhogg is really just a buildup on that first phase. You haven't really done most of these mechanics since the start. And then there's a few more things added in with the Akmorns dealing the damage, the Bomberman orbs, which are probably the most iconic thing here. Not to mention the stacking, tank stack, I suppose. So there's just a lot of little elements here that add up to a really enjoyable fight. The music, the arena changing, everything is just, it's so extravagant. I wish Enraged Nidhogg was in Dragonsong Reprise. Not as another phase, mind you. I just wish he was there. I don't want that fight being any longer than it already was. But honestly, I can't praise this extreme enough. And you'll hear me say similar things when we get to Shadowbringers, to a similar style encounter. But when you nail extremes like this, even the most hardcore of player isn't really in it for the challenge anymore. They're in it for everything else. And Nidhogg nails that. So it's crazy to think that Nidhogg's just number 3, because I feel like number 2 and number 1 do that for me, but they also do other things. So the big thing is number 2 is Thornton. I think some people will be surprised that that's not number 1, but also you now know what my number 1 is, so you're probably not surprised at that either. And honestly, for me, Thornton and Nidhogg kind of tied between like second and third. That was another tough decision. But so let me back up. Thornton is often referred to as the pinnacle of EX trial difficulty. It was used as a bridge to get people gear, specifically a new weapon, to help them with the DPS checks in Gordius turn 3 against Living Liquid. It didn't really achieve that super well, but it means that he was designed with that kind of upper difficulty in mind. So at the time, his scaling was something that punished a lot of pickup groups when it came to trying to do this encounter. It has a ton of mechanical dances, micro DPS checks within the different phases, tight mitigation checks, and attention checks. I mean, it demands the same things that a raid would demand of you, and also has all that extravagance, all of that aesthetic, the music, everything. Although I don't know if I was really a huge fan of the phase 1 music. I mean, Heroes now scars me. Every time I hear it, I just kind of, ugh. But at the same time, I get wanting to build into Heroes for that last phase, but it also just feels like it should be there the whole time for me. The other music doesn't really do it quite the same, but at least they're going for that same effect, that kind of build up into that last phase when Heroes kicks in. And it does work. I am really glad when it happens, but even still. Now, I will say that nowadays, the Thornton encounter is much less impressive. All of the mechanics that are here are like dungeon mechanics now, or like easy EX mechanics. Now we've had so much exposure to the stuff that used to be sort of unique. Like they kind of also used Thornton as a means of teaching people mechanics that were used in Coil. So it was again this kind of weird dichotomy between these being Savage style mechanics, or what would have been the Savage equivalent with the final Coils, and it being an extreme difficulty trial at the same time, which then leads into the difficulty that they designed it with. And there's not as many mechanics that feel that thematic to Thornton until the final phase. Stuff like the spear throw, stuff like the eyes appearing around the arena. But everything else is like a mishmash of AoEs and things that we've seen before, just put together in a more difficult kind of situation. But if you were to take someone in nowadays who's been playing for the past several years, they probably wouldn't understand why Thornton was regarded the way that it was, or even something like this video is regarded the way that it is. But for me, the big thing is it still has such a high bar of quality compared to a lot of other extreme trials that we've had even to this day, that it deserves this spot full and through with both its history and how it stacks up against other stuff nowadays. And that takes us into our number 1, which is Sephiroth. Veni, Veni, Venios. That is the achievement for beating the extreme, but we're not talking about that Sephiroth. But it's, again, another EX trial that just, to me, shows that it has a massive quality difference than the other stuff we've seen in recent years. It's not only my favorite Heavensward trial, but it's one of my favorite trials to this day. I don't think it was unseeded until Shadowbringers, to be honest. It just combines so many things at once into a fast and frantic fight. Phase 1 alternates between two mechanics, but doesn't really overstay its welcome, and both mechanics are quite threatening on their own. They're neither bothersome, so you get through that first phase, you feel good and accomplished about it. Then you move on to the add phase, which has this massive tank mitigation check, and if either of your tanks dies, it falls apart really quick. Not to mention, every add you destroy is doing incredibly annoying amounts of damage. The big adds, super threatening. The little adds explode frequently enough that it can cause issues and a little bit of a panic attack when it comes to playing healer in there. Trust me, I know. And on top of that, when you then move into that final phase, the giant spectacle and the fake Power Man 5000 music that kicks in, it just sets such a mood. Again, the atmosphere, the aesthetic, it all works so well. And it just, for me, works as well as some of the other things. I don't think it's as extravagant as Nidhog and Thornton, but for something that's not those like MSQ EX trial fights, it really, again, just stands above for me. Not to mention the final phase shows that Square can do stationary bosses. There are a few stands at the wall, stationary bosses they've done well, and this is one of them because Sephiroth himself is so animated and you're constantly shifting around the arena for baits, spreads, tethers, adds, all this kind of stuff, knockbacks, expanding AoEs, the damage resistance phase that you have to do a couple of times. It just has everything. Back in the day, it also had no resurrections when you fell off the arena, and they fixed that when the Unreal trial came around. But one thing I realized when it came around with Unreal is that it didn't feel like, oh man, back in my day, you know, we wouldn't have been able to res from that. Or I didn't feel that way at all because the rest of the fight was still demanding so much of my attention and my admiration that I realized that wasn't really a defining factor. Not like it was with Titan. On Titan, falling off was like a defining factor, something about that fight that when taken away felt like it was missing. Sephiroth isn't that. He doesn't need that to stand out because all the other aspects of the fight work so well together that still one of my favorite fights to this day, and I highly recommend it. I know you might have missed Unreal, but you can always go back and do it, right? And that is going to be a wrap for my Heavensward trial ranking. Man, it feels so good to look back at these. And I'm really looking forward to looking at the Stormblood stuff next, because obviously the next videos will be the Stormblood raid series and that of Omega, which, trust me, fresh on my mind right now, as well as the trial series with the 4 lords, as well as Tsukiyomi, Shinryu, Susanoo, and I'm forgetting the level 87 one. How am I doing that? What was it? I can't remember. I actually can't remember in the middle of the video. Oh, I feel dumb. I guess that's going in last place in the... I guess that one's last place when I actually do the thing. Because oh, Lakshmi. Yeah, no, that's definitely going in last place, and I have multiple reasons for that. Spoiler alert. Anyway, looking forward to doing those videos. Hopefully you are too. So be sure to check out the playlist. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and let me know what your rankings are for the Heavensward trial series, if you were around at the very least. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, take care.